here at the People's Forum who made it possible for us to have this event, a very important event. I might say the best thing about the 75th anniversary week for NATO happening anywhere right now is this fantastic text, NATO, A Reckoning with the Atlantic Alliance, which I have to say we're very happy to be here for the New York book launch, but this is already a bestseller in Germany. So I think we should all commit here tonight, not just to buy the book, to read the book, but to spread it around and make it a bestseller here in the United States. Of course, we are very, very happy to have with us our esteemed author, Sevim Dagdelen, who many of you, I'm sure, already know from her many appearances. And I have to say, first and foremost, to start from being really on the front lines of the struggle to free Julian Assange, who, of course, has just achieved his freedom. But also, of course, a member of the Bundestag since 2005, and currently the foreign policy spokesperson for the Sahra Wagenknecht Alliance for Reason and Justice, and also a member of Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs. And we are also very happy to be joined alongside Sevim in conversation with Katrina vanden Heuvel, who many of us know, myself, of course, included, as a longtime weekly reader of The Nation, the editorial director and publisher of The Nation, which is the leading source of progressive politics and culture in the written word here in the United States. She was also the editor of the magazine from 1995 to 2019, frequent commentator on many different channels, author of many different fantastic books. So we're so happy to have you with us as well, Katrina. So we're going to have some questions up here, a good conversation. I think there will be a lot to be said. Then we'll open it up briefly. I'm sure you all have many questions and points you want to make, and then we're going to leave some time also at the end because I'm sure there will be many folks who would like Sevim to sign their copy of the text. So don't worry, we will leave time for that. We won't rush you out. But Sevim, to start, I wanted to ask, I mean, maybe it's the most obvious question, but here we are, 75 years of NATO. Why write this book and why now?
Yeah, thank you, Eugene. Thanks, Katrina. And thanks the People Forum having me here and make it possible to have this book launch here in New York. And first of all, maybe if you go, I don't know how exactly it is in the United States, but if you go to a bookshop in Germany, you can see a lot of books about NATO. A lot of books about NATO, but not a single book what is critical on NATO. So the 99% of the books, they are just reproducing the self-image of the NATO. And I thought it's really more than time to the 75th anniversary of the NATO to make a reckoning, write a reckoning about the great myth of the NATO. And to just make a test, you know, the self-image, the legends of the NATO, and what is the reality of the NATO. That was actually my aim with this book. And to make it very clear, I just want to read from the introduction of the book, a very small piece, what makes it clear what was my intention. The NATO myth romanticizes people's view of reality. If we want to find ways out of the current crisis, we need to unmask them. This is what the present book does. Today, 75 years after the founding of NATO, this military pact, its global expansion, and its confrontational policies are driving the world to the brink of World War III more than ever before. The aim of this book's critical analysis of both the current course of the alliance and its past crimes is to create the preconditions for thinking productively about alternatives. Alternatives to NATO, a military alliance that single-mindedly pursues a policy of deterrence, arms build-up, and confrontation, and that therefore existentially endangers the peaceful cohabitation of humanity. That is actually that was the intention to show the reality of the NATO, and then to try to organize a discussion, an open discussion about the alternatives and what could we do? Because I see, especially with the Washington summit of NATO, a really big danger or that we are staying on the brink of World War III.
Katrina, I wanted to ask you a similar question, and I'm glad, Sevim, you mentioned the issue of sort of a space and a discussion about what's going on with NATO, because one of the points you mentioned in your foreword that I thought was very important was the conversation here in the United States in the late 90s around the expansion of NATO and the broad range of, I have to say, I was shocked to see that Richard Pipes was one of them. It sort of blew me away. And I wonder, what you think in terms of relating that moment to our current moment, why the intellectual space, the media space, has become so closed down on this issue, and where at one point we had seems like an open, wide-ranging discussion, now it seems we can't have one at all.
Eugene, thank you, and thank you so much, Sevim. Was honored to do the foreword. Sevim has a piece at thenation.com today. I think you raised the issue, and so did Sevim, of alternatives. My late husband, Steve, and I spent a lot of time in Moscow, and we got to know Gorbachev, and I know there are different views of Gorbachev, but as someone who was the highest-ranking leader to be a nuclear abolitionist, he also had a different view of what could happen to replace NATO after the end of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany. And it was not a military view. It was an alternative common European home. Maybe it was too visionary, from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And I think the relationship between the United States and Russia at that time was opening as opposed to clamping down now toward a new, more dangerous Cold War, as Sevim writes. There were many people across a range, as you put it. George Kennan, Tom Friedman, Bill Bradley, Ben and Jerry's, still Gary Hart. And then, of course, there were people at the nation and around the nation who understood the dangers of an expanded NATO. But Bill Clinton went ahead. There wasn't as, in the foreign policy life in this country, there's not a lot of democracy. And I think part of it was Clinton appealing to constituencies in the heart of the country, the Baltic nations, Poles, but also he wanted to divert attention from Monica Lewinsky. I'm not kidding. No, seriously, these are how some decisions are made. And there was, as Sevim and I talk about, and it's in her book, the broken promise. There's a lot of dispute about this, but when Germany reunified, there was a promise that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. Instead, under George W., there were increasing numbers of members. Now I think it's 32. And I just think there was more space back then. Not a lot. There's not a lot in this country to talk about alternatives. But there was a sense that, that you needed a debate. And today it's been so militarized. The discussions are literally, there's no dialogue. It's really, give me your weapons list. And I think that's the danger, the real danger, and to rethink how we discuss and to revive dialogue. And I will say, I think it was last night, Biden gave a press conference, and I'll stop, but it was essentially defense of empire. And all these people saying, well, he looked good, fundamental mastery of foreign affairs. He name-checked indispensable nation twice, as Sevim writes. The United States is more isolated today than ever. He even name-checked Madeleine Albright. Sorry. We can do better. Sorry.
No, I think it's an important point because, looking at the summit this week, it just seems the need for the conversation seems even more. And honestly, looking and I was trying to avoid it, to be honest with you, but of course, I'm a journalist, so you have to follow some of it. One of the things you talk about in the book that really was sticking with me watching the conversation here is NATO being overstretched. Because so much of what we were hearing was, NATO needs to go to Asia, NATO needs to do this, all these different almost this worldwide scenario, despite being called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that concept of NATO being overstretched and the implications of it, because it was really striking to see the sort of worldwide war vision that was on display there.
Yes, first maybe on the 75th anniversary of such an organization, what is not very usual for organizations, for institutions, to have the 75th anniversary. But it looks like it is on the height of their institution, and that they are staying on a hill, which is windy, and they are enjoying the hill, and thinking they are very much in the height of their power. But I do think that NATO is facing their deepest crisis, actually. The deepest crisis they ever had in the history of 75 years. Why? Is that, first of all, they are facing big challenges for their existence, actually. Existential threats are there. They are having an escalation policy. They just deepened their strategy of escalation in their proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. What that means is more weapons, more heavier weapons, more money for Ukraine. On the other side, it means less money for the own population. So we can see it in Germany, for example, or some other economic critical countries in Europe, like they have less money for infrastructure, less money for healthcare, less money for education, yeah, and because they have to get more money for Ukraine, and you cannot spend $1 twice. You just can't do it. So, and that's why they just have to cut all the social security, not all of it maybe, but lots of it. And the other thing is they are expanding. So the strategy of expansion goes on. After they had the expansion strategy in Europe with the enlargement of Sweden and Finland now, 32 states, and they have the expansion now towards Asia. We are facing a NATOization in Asia against China because of the claim of the United States to rule the world. And not only to rule the world, it's also like the US President Biden said very recently, I'm ruling the world.
I run the world.
I run the world. I'm asking myself who voted for him in the world. Has he ever been facing elections in the world to govern the world and to rule the world? But the thing is, the US is in decline, and they are trying to stick on their hegemony worldwide, and that's why they know that China is rising to the first economy in the world, and that's why they want to challenge China somehow. With the help of some vassal states in Asia, like the Pacific Four, Asian Pacific Four, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, plus Philippines and Singapore and some others, like they do in Europe, in the war against Russia, the Ukraine war. They are using, for example, Germany in the front line as a frontline state against Russia. So they are trying to use Philippines against Asia. And the other thing is, the third point is this escalation policy, expansion policy, goes on with a policy of rearmament, massively rearmament. They put so much money into this war machine. And this is questioned by more and more people. More and more people, for example, in Europe, they're questioning the NATO alliance as a defense alliance, and this is one of the great myths of the alliance. They say we are a defense alliance, we are an alliance of democracies and state of rule of law, and we are an alliance of values like human rights, etc. And more people just don't believe this. Facing this escalation policy, they don't believe it. And the NATO is called North Atlantic Treaty Organization. China is not at the Atlantic. It is just not, And what's about going to the Indo-Pacific region, So that brings me to the point. This signal from the Washington summit to go global, NATO goes global, is also on just the expense, what were on very high expenses. And many people, they just don't fit with this expenses and this cost. For example, in Germany, we have an opinion poll from December last year, and that is very important. The Article 5 of the NATO treaty is actually the heart, the essence of the NATO treaty. It says that if one of the members is being attacked, that everyone stands together in it's defending the member.
And I think it was invoked once in 9/11.
Yes, in Afghanistan. But the thing is, the majority of the people in Germany are not willing to defend other member states anymore. They just don't want to follow Article 5 of the NATO treaty. That means actually they don't want the essence of the NATO treaty. They don't accept it anymore. So the NATO is just functioning as if every member state is accepting and respecting Article 5. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And this is something what happens now in Germany and in some other member states as well. The criticism is rising, and that's why I think they are just overstretching. This is the overstretching itself with the expansion and more escalation and more rearmament.
I think it's important to understand that NATO is, it's not a tea party, which sounds odd. It's not a coffee klatch. Yeah. No, it's a military organization which benefits the arms dealers, because the main lobby for the expansion of NATO around the Clinton times were the military, the arms weapons manufacturers. And the danger now is that there's a justification, this is apart from Ukraine and the expansion of NATO, for more military equipment to NATO. And there's this interoperability clause where, you know, they have to buy from the US. And it's just, there's more and more spending on weapons at the expense, as Sevim said, of bridges, of, you know, of lives, of social welfare. And this is just growing. It's just growing. And the thinking here, the political economy, is that it's kind of military Keynesianism. The politicians will say that we're creating jobs through arming countries. And there is this mandate, as I said, for other countries to buy US weapons. So that's the history of it. And those who talk about common defense or peace and stability or providing security, I mean, I think Sevim makes a very good case in her book about NATO's providing more insecurity and more instability as it expands. I also think of going back in US history, it's not US only, but the rollback crowd. It's always kind of been rollback versus containment, not that containment is so great, but you do see the elements of rollback now. There are folks who want to see regime change in Russia, who want to push leadership out. Now, I'm not making the brief for Putin, but I think so much of what we're looking at is a consequence of the demonization of Russia. And 2007, I've always thought the Munich Security Conference was important, and not to overstate it, but Putin stood there and gave a speech which was not wild. It was simply saying the unipolar world is over. And it was reality. And, you know, I'm not sure America's in decline. I think a lot of countries are in decline, but it's not acknowledging, it's in denial about it is no longer number one. And Angela Merkel was sitting in the front row with McCain and Lieberman, you remember that? And they freaked out. And I think they go back to their capitals and decide that, you know, we need to rein this in. And that was the beginning in a way. We can't forget that Ukraine didn't start in 2013 or 14. It was prior to that in the squares and the yellow revolution, the orange revolution. So I think there's a big history. I won't say more, but I think the fact that we've had Russiagate for the last 6-7 years is a consequence of trying to ensure the demonization of Russia, to continue a Cold War that could have ended, and the lost opportunities that we now face are very expensive. I saw the bridge in Baltimore the other day that went down, you know, and they said in the news article, we can't afford, the state said, $1.6 billion. I think at the end of these news stories, there should be like carrier, attack missile, and what they cost. Because it's like 1-to-1 in a sense of what you're losing. And we need a 21st century conversion program that will move people to other jobs that are more productive, and just to tamp down the militarism that I think, you know, kind of infects our country.
No, I think, yes, please. I think that deserves a round of applause. Incredibly important point. The F-35 fighter, you know, they spent $1.7 trillion on it, and it doesn't work. Every story about it is like, oh, it doesn't work. F-22 also, which has fallen out of the news, did not work.
The Pentagon's never passed an audit. Bernie Sanders and I think Ron Ron Paul used to pass a piece of legislation every year to audit the Pentagon.
Yeah, there's a sense of unreality to it, and I'm glad you raised the issue of the demonization of Russia, because I mean, it seems so much of the discourse is driven by this sense of unreality, Sevim. I mean, you've got Poland, of course, you've got the Baltic states who are pushing this, this demonization agenda, which is so aggressive. And I want to build off what you were saying about Article 5 and ask you, I mean, what is the impact inside of Europe and inside of the alliance of the fact that you've got some people who are pushing super aggressively in one way, where it seems a very significant chunk of Europe is now starting to say, should we be pushing right up to the brink of World War III? Should we be, continuing these endless wars? I mean, I don't want to predict the breakup of anything, but you just wonder what it portends, because it seems like there's sharpening political lines here on the continent. Well, I think really if you could just sort of bring out what you think in relationship to the point you were making on Article 5 and how people are less willing to embrace it. What does it mean for the continent? What does it mean for the alliance to have a certain group of countries pushing very aggressively while the discourse and the conversation in other countries is becoming at least somewhat more critical of the idea of an Article 5, of going to war in a potential World War III scenario?
Well, the thing is that we have a disconnection between politics and media on the other, one side, and the population on the other side. Like, for example, 55% in Germany are against the membership of Ukraine in the NATO, because they know that that means World War III maybe, yeah? That means escalation, that means conflict with Russia. And even in East Germany, even it is more like in the former GDR, it's more than 70% that people are against the membership of Ukraine. And so you can go on in Hungary, for example, or in Slovakia. Many people are against this membership because they see what it can cost the people. But on the other side, you have the elites in politics, in media, in economy. They have other interests. And so you have a clash between the population's will, the will of the majority of the population, and the will of the elites. And as we have seen, for example, in the European parliamentary elections very lately in June, you could have seen the results of this election were actually a sign of this disconnection, because the most of the people they voted in favor of right-wing parties, for example, and these right-wing parties they are actually more in favor of militarization. They are not against NATO, like for example the far-right party in Germany. They are in favor of NATO. They voted in favor of the membership of Sweden and Finland. That means they're in favor of the enlargement of and expansion of NATO. They are in favor of 2% of GDP for military expenses, and they have no problem with intervention in general. But they are against the weapon deliveries to Ukraine. And they are against the sanctions against Russia. And so people think they are peace parties. And it's the same with the far right in France, far right in Austria, in so many other countries are the far right parties giving the image that they are not in favor of war policies or NATO. And they have been elected. They got a lot of votes. That means that the populations are trying to protest against the elite, the establishment parties, the governmental parties, and that shows us that it can go worse. Whoever wants to combat far-right parties and policies, they have to change their politics. But this is not going to happen. When you see the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was just at the Washington NATO summit and signed a communique, not in my name, signed a communique without any discussion in the public in Germany, any discussion in the parliament, any discussion in the Foreign Affairs Committee, signed the communique of the NATO, which says that foreign country or foreign force, foreign empire, like the United States, will now station long-range weapons, the missiles, like the Pershing II, in Germany. And in addition to that, they are making a new center for command, for coordination of the Ukrainian military help and supplies in Wiesbaden. So, and this in the name of Germany, and I think it's not in our name, because that brings us more to the danger to be part of the conflict. I mean, we are a part of the conflict, you know. It's US weapons, German weapons, NATO weapons used by Ukrainian soldiers in this war. And we are training them in Germany. We are sending them information via the Secret Service to target in the war. And now we have already the discussions about sending troops. You know, the French President Macron made this proposal. Some German politicians also supported this proposal to send NATO troops to Ukraine, and even send more long-range weapons like the Taurus to send them to Ukraine, which can hit, these weapons can hit Moscow, the Kremlin. And this was their aim. The German politicians like Kiesewetter from the Christian Democratic Party, from the opposition party, they say we have to enable Ukraine to hit the ministries in Moscow. Just imagine the ministries in Moscow hitting them, attacking them with German weapons. And then just remember our history, you know, 2 world wars started, 2 attacks against Russia in the past. Russia is undefeated, has been undefeated, and now the 3rd time. I think this is going to be worse than in the age of so many nuclear weapons they have, the nuclear powers. So the thing is, we have such a disconnection, you know, and this is making the crisis even bigger. In Europe, the political crisis, besides the economic crisis, what this war is causing in Germany and in Europe. And we are facing a downfall of Europe just because of this war, because the economic warfare against Russia is on the cost of the populations of Europe. Not the US. We pay a lot more times more for energy, for example, than you guys doing. We have skyrocketing energy prices, skyrocketing food prices, housing prices, everything just because of this war. And we have a shrinking economy in Germany. The forecast of the IMF is 0.2% for Germany. The forecast for Russia is 3.2%. That means, you know, the German Foreign Minister Baerbock said the goal of the sanctions against Russia is to ruin Russia. That's what they're ruining, is the German economy and the German working class people. And I think we have to stop this insane policy against the will of the majority of the population very immediately.
The normalization of nuclear weapons has been a part of the last year, with people on television, not just military, saying maybe a little tactical nuclear weapon.
Yeah,
taboo is gone. Taboo is gone. Yeah. And what's also gone is, and you know, I think the younger generation, I mean, it's active shooting at schools, but it's not, you don't see 1 million people in Central Park, which was the case in June 1982, which worked to abolish a whole category of nuclear weapons. And I think that needs to come back onto the terrain. And this is a moment, because with the normalization should be the horror. And we're coming upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it's, I was going to say also that the rules-based order, that's another phrase. I sometimes think journalists have a key on their computer, like indispensable nation. Now we can add, I run the world. But the rules-based order, whose rules, right? And I think that's something Sevim writes about and addresses in the book too. But the hypocrisy is hard to sustain.
Yeah.
I mean, with Gaza, and the International Criminal Court, and how quickly people moved, and rightly, on Putin. But everyone, the U.S. is in a signatory. We were talking Netanyahu. I remember when the Center for Constitutional Rights, I think, subpoenaed or papered Rumsfeld in Germany during the Iraq War. So there's a hypocrisy that I think people see, and certainly people in encampments. And I think that's critical. I mean, there's another institution which I always say is flawed but indispensable, the UN. Now, the General Assembly has done some good things, right? But it could have, there could be another set of institutions at this time. And NATO is dominating the field, right? I mean, it's sucking the oxygen out of the air. And OSCE and these other institutions are being brutally kind of instrumentalized or weaponized. But to find new institutions is something that should be part of a quest and not just new weapons. I will say last thing is Biden and his team, the escalation, I don't have my notes with me, but a year ago there was like no attack men, no, and now it's a question of how far and deep they can go into Russia. Now there's been brutality in Ukraine, but the vengeance isn't going to work it out. I told Sevim the other day that, the reconstruction czar for Ukraine was appointed a few months ago, not well known, is Penny Pritzker, whose brother is the governor of Illinois. Yeah. She was Commerce Secretary in the Obama administration. But the cost of reconstruction, I mean, these institutions, the World Bank, estimating $1 trillion. And the meetings that have been held so far, the money's not going to be there. And this country doesn't have a great legacy in leaving countries and working to reconstruct.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up on some of those points, and I'm building off of, I think, the points that Sevim made about the sort of fake poses of the far right. I mean, one of the things I think is most important about this text is it gives us the space to talk more in English from a left perspective about this. But I'm curious your perspective on how to address, Donald Trump's so-called anti-war pose. I think for many progressive people, people are so starved to hear something, and of course he's being put up as the so-called anti-NATO person.
I mean, he's proud. I mean, he's kind of the huckster, unhinged. But, I don't know if we really want to make NATO about paying the 2% GDP. I mean, that's what he cares about. It's like a business transaction. And that he's going to be in a room and Putin and he will work out a deal. I mean, what's happened with Russiagate is that it's made Putin seem infallible. He put a president, my Russian journalist friends say, well, you're giving him all this power. He put a president on the throne in America. He's dictating this and that. I will say on the Middle East, which Sevim knows more about, we had a reporter look at Trump and Biden's records. It's not happy on either front, but Trump is tied into the far right in Israel and in this country, AIPAC, Adelson. And it's not an article, but it's raising questions. You know the history of Iran-Contra, the history of Republican, like what they did with Jimmy Carter, Reagan team trying to make sure the hostages were not released. It's more and more well documented. I think it's worth raising questions about what's going on with Jared Kushner behind the scenes with Trump in terms of postponing any kind of movement or But Trump, it's complicated because on trade, he understands trade has led to some of the, far right because people feel shafted and deindustrialized. But I don't see him as a peace candidate. I also don't see, though, just writing off people. Sevim and I were talking like Thomas Massey. There are people who are non-interventionist and believe in the role of Congress in matters of war and peace. But someday I'd like to see a debate where the candidates vie as to how to end wars, not to sustain them.
Please.
May I? Regarding Trump versus Biden, two examples. The one Katrina mentioned, the Middle East. For example, when Trump was president, he left the JCPOA treaty with Iran and the nuclear deal with Iran, what was a hope for us as well. And he just left it. And it was very hard for us Europeans to cope with the situation because we were sticking into this JCPOA deal because it was a good deal for everybody. But we couldn't realize what we promised Iran because of the sanctions then Trump started. He had 1,500 sanctions against Iran he made, so it made it really impossible to trade with Iran, and that was the deal, that was part of the deal, to make trade with Iran. Biden, when he was campaigning, he promised actually to go back on track with the JCPOA, but he didn't after he was elected, and he made 700 plus sanctions against Iran. So that means there is not so much differences, but regarding Israel and Gaza and Palestine, I think Trump will be worse than Biden, and I think Biden is already very bad with his unconditional support for this extreme right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu, and is supporting the war crimes and so on. And but just remember, it was Trump who changed the capital of them to Jerusalem. So the U.S. Embassy, he moved to Jerusalem and changed it. So I think it is a little bit, for me, for a European, it looks like a choice between pest and cholera sometimes. When I look to the U.S., I think maybe some other aspects you have to consider regarding the elections, like trade, economy, social security, and all this stuff. But in between them, in the Middle East policy, I do not see such a substantial difference. But I know that IPAC is a little bit more, or let's see, the Abraham records, that Trump is a little bit more sharp in supporting Netanyahu, I think.
And Saudi, I was going to say also, Sevim brought up Iran. The elections there were interesting because this reformist candidate, reformist within the context of Iran, but he's reputed to bring back the negotiator, Zarif, and the White House, this White House, maybe they have too much going on, but they just said no comment. There was no outreach of any kind. And I see you have materials about Cuba. There was hope. I mean, Obama, in retrospect, and I was in Havana about 2 years ago, and what struck me was how important the Obama visit was as a measure of respect and dignity. And the fact that Biden hasn't moved, it so clearly, I suspect, as in Germany, domestic constituencies, the history of Florida and the right-wing Cubans. But that, too, is the sanctioning is criminal. And the over-sanctioning is... And we've learned it just doesn't work because this idea that it targets the elite, no, it targets people.
And the other thing about the difference, I think regarding NATO, there is no difference because some are saying Trump would be anti-NATO. This is bullshit because he is, NATO is an organization to fulfill the geostrategic and security interests of the United States. That's the organization. It's not an organization for the protection or the security for Europe. It's really it was founded 1949 just for building a Pax Americana in Europe, on the European continent, of essential influence zone for the United States on the European continent, not only facing the Soviet Union challenge, also to make sure and to guarantee to save the capitalist system. It was an economical aim as well, to not just political and militarily, it was also to protect the capitalist system. Therefore, they founded illegal organizations, underground organizations like Gladio, for example, in Italy, to make Gladio as an underground organization, illegal organization, armed, funded, trained by the NATO. They did terrorist attacks and called them, they would be left-wing organizations, just to prevent that the Communist Party in Italy goes into the government. That was the reason for their terrorist attacks. And it's all done by this Gladio organization. And you had this in Turkey. Experts say the grey wolves are stay behind organization of the NATO as well, like the Gladio, or there was an extreme right network, NSO, in Germany, who did for several years terrorist attacks against migrants and so on to destabilize Germany. And experts say they are a stay-behind organization of NATO, which was very much cooperated with the internal secret service in Germany. So you had this all before, and I do believe that Trump, for example, and the US wants always these organizations like the NATO for their own interests. And who else is more America first interests policy than Trump? And he pushed the Europeans to pay more for the expenses of the NATO, for military, and for the armies, like the 2% of the GDP, and is pushing them actually more forward to get it more than just 2%, because I think he studied. Yeah, no, there is a military strategist, a Chinese military strategist, Un Tzu. He wants his theory was, to lead wars without not on your own costs, but on the costs of others. So, and that is what Trump is aiming, from my perspective. He wants.
He may
to
have
lead.
this place wired. He'll start quoting you.
And that's why I think there is not so much difference. That is just. I think the liberals in Europe, they are just trying to make a big threat want to paint a big danger of Trump in justifying this, in saying that he is anti-NATO and we need someone who is pro-NATO, because pro-NATO means pro-European, and this is just bullshit. I think this is propaganda. It doesn't matter who the president is in the United States. Every president in this state, because it's ruled by the war machine, by the military-industrial complex, will be on the side of the NATO.
I hate to, it's a very crass quip, but I think at the time of the creation of NATO, the idea was to keep Russia out, keep Germany down, and keep America in. Yeah. And I wish at the end of the war that there was more attention to anti-colonialism than to anti-communism, because it just ravaged, as you said, the hypocrisy of Russiagate was that the United States with CIA, other agencies were funding Italian parties to keep communism down. The last thing I'll say is it relates to Sevim's point about the NATOization, the encirclement of Asia, is NATO's always been in search of a mission. I mean, after the, quote, end of the Cold War, it was in search of an out-of-area mission. That's the language they use. And now they're finding it in buckets. And I just wish in Washington there'd been an ounce of humility and reflection on NATO. It was just a cheerleader summit, which was odious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Sevim, I know you bring this out in the book, Afghanistan, Libya, all of these other pieces, which, Yugoslavia in so many ways, these it's the so-called defensive alliance is constantly starting these wars. But another point I thought you made about this, these moves by NATO that I thought was important was the hypocrisy of their language on human rights. You mentioned Erdogan, all these other things. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that's an important aspect of how it's presented, and what we saw in the last week is like, this is the great democratic human rights home of the world.
Yeah, the first is the saying they are alliance of democracies. That's just historically a lie, because one of the founding member states was Portugal. And Portugal, under the fascist dictatorship of Salazar. Salazar had, till the revolution 1974, they had colonial wars in Africa. They tortured Africans in concentration camps in Mozambique, in Angola. And you can have, there is a memorial in Tarrafal on the island Cape Verde in Africa. You can see what they did to this people. The other thing was, so they had no problems with dictatorships, with fascists. Even they had treaties with Spanish dictator Franco, the fascist. The United States had bilateral treaties with them. Then you had the founding member state, Greece, 1967, military coup. Was no problem at all for NATO as an alliance of democracies. Or 1980, you had the military coup in Turkey. That was not a problem at all. You know, all this repression against opponents, political prisoners, killing the political prisoners, and so on. Everything was not a problem for NATO. They never ever criticized these developments in Turkey, Greece, or even the occupation of north of Cyprus by the NATO member state Turkey, and it's still divided. You have still the occupation, illegal occupation, a breach of international law, and that was not and is still not a problem for NATO. And the other thing was, you mentioned it with an alliance, a collective of human rights and values. I mean, you don't that much talk about values thing here, but in Germany and Europe, every speech about NATO is a speech about the alliance of values. Yeah, absolutely. Moralism and and integrity and so on, and it's just such a hypocrisy. And till today, you have a torture center in Guantanamo Bay, where they torture people without trial, without anything, no rights at all, and it's still going on. They didn't close it. And 14 years they prosecuted the NATO member state, USA, a journalist, Julian Assange, just because he exposed war crimes of USA in Iraq or the NATO in Afghanistan. And the other thing is, according to the Brown University, in the last 20 years, they killed USA and their allies. They killed more than 4.5 million people in their war on terror. 4.5 million people they killed. So the body count, I mean, just in the last 20 years, it's so high. And what kind of values did they defend in killing 4.5 million people? What kind of values would justify such a mass murdering, mass slaughtering? And the other thing is, I mean, if you look to Gaza, what a hypocrisy. What a hypocrisy that they talk about human rights when more than 15,000 children got killed there in Gaza, and they don't say anything on this. And the people say, and that's why they're losing their moral integrity. And they lost their moral integrity since a long time, at least in the global south. But now with this really awful war against the civilians in Palestine, in Gaza, and killing all these people and doing these war crimes, what you cannot justify with self-defense anymore. It's just, they're losing even the moral integrity in the global north. So many countries of the European Union, like Spain, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, they accepted and recognized Palestine as a independent state, and they are criticizing the arms exports of the global north to Israel in fueling this war against the civil society there, the civilians. And I think this shows that this myth was the defense alliance of democracies, and alliance of human rights is just a lie. And more and more people, they do see this.
Well, Sevim, I'll ask you this, and Katrina, I also like your thoughts on the same thing, because there has to be alternatives. There has to be something different. In the latter half of your book, you talk about different ways. Things can be different. There can be a different idea and different pieces. So I hope you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that sort of go-forward policy is also important. I think we'll read the book, we'll love the book, we'll enjoy the book, but what we need to really advocate for when we're talking about how to bring a real zone of peace.
Well, I do believe that we do need a connection, a cooperation more of the freedom and peace-loving people in the global north with the people in the global south. That is the first thing what we need. The second thing is we have to get back on the track of international law. No double standards. No double standards. If someone is breaching international law, it has consequences, but it cannot be that everyone else except the NATO member states get punished for breaching international law, but the NATO is the cover-up for violation, for illegal wars, and so on. So we have to get on track. Everybody has to accept the UN Charter, because this is the best basis for international relations. And the third thing is we have to go back to diplomacy. We really have to go back to diplomacy. Diplomacy is how can you say, it is a win of civilization. After World War II, it was clear that we have to have diplomatic relation with every country. And I can't understand, for example, after they failed with their regime change policy against Syria, that they still have no diplomatic relations to Syria. They don't have diplomatic relations to Venezuela after they failed with their illegal regime change policy. They don't have and they don't want any diplomacy with Russia. But this is wrong. If you want peace in international relations, the precondition is to have a dialogue, to have diplomacy. If you have a war like in Ukraine, if you want to stop the war, you have to send diplomats and not weapons. This is very simple logic. And the other thing is we have to stop with the policy of sanctioning unipolar sanctions, one-sided sanctions. The only institution in the world who has the right to sanction other countries is the UN Security Council. But the reality is that the United States and the European Union, as an accompaniment of the United States, is just sanctioning whoever they want, whoever they like, because they don't like the nose of the one head of state, or the social welfare state of the other state, and so on. And like they do with Cuba, they don't accept the sovereignty of independent countries, and we do have to stop that, because the sanctions, it's always, independent from the fact if they affect the elites in a country, it does affect the normal population, and it's a weapon of mass destruction. Before one single bomb was attacking the Iraqi people, more than 500,000 people have been killed in Iraq because of the economic sanctions. And this is the result of sanctions. People are dying in Syria because of the sanctions. They have no medicine, diabetes, or any other health issues with the heart. They don't have the medicine for that, and I think it's just a crime, this sanction policy, and we have to stop this. And the other thing is we have to have, again, we say conflict-free solutions. We have to stick on solutions which are not bringing us to a new conflict, but to solve the conflicts, and in a diplomatic way. And we have really a lot of examples for doing this. Like in Germany, we had in the 1950s a referendum on a state which is in the West. It was part of France for a short time after the Second World War, and then they made a referendum if they stay as a part of France or as they are going to Germany. A lot of people are disappointed, and they say, if I would know this, I would have voted in favor of staying in France. But we had these democratic referendums, and this is probably a solution. A possible way to have a solution in the east of Ukraine, for example. Or we had in Italy, we had the autonomy region South Tyrol. There are so many, or the internationalization of Spitzbergen. So you have a lot of, in the past, a lot of examples how you can solve conflicts without war, without force, using force, without killing people. And I think we have to go back to this stage.
I want to pick up on that because I think it's important to retrieve in our history models. I think of human security. I think of Sweden, which has now joined NATO, and how tragic in so many ways that is because of Olof Palme and what he was revolutionary in his own way decades ago in thinking about human security. I think we need to demilitarize our thinking because it's become militarized, and the media malpractice in fomenting that. Diplomacy, Sevim talked to this. It's not just not understood, and it is a stodgy word we think of, but it's been criminalized. It's treated as appeasement. And the ability, let's say strategic empathy, that you stand in someone else's shoes, is treated as appeasement. I remember during Iraq, on the eve of the war, around the world, there were protests, and we did a cover called The Other Superpower. And one does despair some mornings because so much of what proposes, whether it's against the expansion of NATO in 1997 or against the war, doesn't seem to work out. But you've got to keep going at it because it will. I think the UN, as Sevim said, its charter is ending the scourge of war. The Security Council has been kind of gridlockized. The General Assembly, I think, has some possibility. I think of the ratification of the nuclear abolition, which is continuing, and ICANN winning the Nobel was important. Civil society, I used to be a little kind of mean-spirited about civil people to people, but I do think it's important, especially in times when, quote, leaders are refusing to meet. Solidarity, Sevim spoke of, I think, transnational solidarity, learning lessons from other countries and sharing. I will say one thing on, so I'll stop, but about many years ago, not that many, Eric Foner, our editorial board member, emailed in the middle of the night and said, does anyone down there have a contact with Bernie? So we said, yeah. So he said, Bernie, he's got to stop with Denmark. He's got to talk about his own country's radical traditions. The abolitionists, the farm labor populists, the suffragettes, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. So Eric Foner wrote a letter, and I do think in this moment of multi-generational tumult, but openness, it's an ability to speak to what was and what can be. So
I just want to add 2 points. The one is disarmament. I mean, the U.S., especially under Trump, they destroyed so much trust. I mean, USA, they left actually almost every agreement on disarmament in the past. And I think it was possible, if it was possible to conclude disarmament agreements with the Soviet Union, the same should be possible with Russia now. And it is actually possible. And we have to, with China anyway, it is possible. So it all depends on the West, actually, to have these agreements on disarmament. And I think we should work on this. And the other thing is the courage of neutrality, that we have to have more neutrality and sovereignty in our countries. I mean, of course, It's from the US perspective, it's a little bit difficult because you are trying to make other states subservient to the United States interest. But from our perspective, it is really, really important to get peace through being neutral, a neutral state, because in the Cold War, for example, neutrality was a protection for states that were neither members of NATO nor of the Warsaw Pact. That was the guarantee not to get attacked. That was the protection. And I do believe that the new membership for Finland and Sweden is not giving them more security. It's the contrary, actually. It does make them more unsecure. And we have to get on track on this especially. And of course, from my point of view, we have to disband NATO. We need in Europe, we need a new European security architecture, which includes Russia. Maybe it sounds fantastic, literally fantastic at the moment of the war, but we need it because without or against Russia, security on the European continent is not possible. Russia is part of Europe. You cannot change geography. And we do need good relations with our neighbors.
Well, I want to take a few questions here from the audience, and please brevity is
I was just going to say one thing.
Please go ahead.
Sevim mentioned the architecture of arms control. I mean, it should be toward abolition, nuclear nonproliferation. But, you know, John Bolton was the one with the 2002 abolition of the ABM, really began the unraveling. And there's no infrastructure now. The scaffolding is almost completely dismantled. But just on the media front, I mean, John Bolton lives on MSNBC. And during the Russiagate peak, you had Brennan, you had people who called for high-tech lynching of Julian Assange. I mean, they have a lot of space. What are they doing on MSNBC? And left progressives began to admire and consider these people arbiters of integrity because they were anti-Trump. And that's really, I think it's dangerous. When you're anti-someone, you do it on your own terms and other terms, but not these people. I mean, we learned, didn't we, not to trust some of these?
You would hope we did. You would hope we did. So we'll take a few. I saw you in the back first, and then we'll come over here to the right. I don't know where Kate has our mic runner. So we'll take a few. Thank you.
Hi, hello. I'm super excited to read your book. I think it's super important, especially for the English kind of population. When I talk to my friends, they have this, very propagandized view of NATO, and I think that's probably commonplace in North America. One question that I had, it feels a lot like NATO is at its peak power. They have all of these weapons. They have they're going all over the world, not going after China. But if there's anything that's going to actually cause them to either change strategy or to potentially, collapse, what would that force be? Is it from within? Is it from without? Is it a combination? I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Do you want to take a couple?
Oh, couple.
It's up to you. Okay, perfect. So let's go here.
My cognitive abilities were.
Yeah.
I took a cognitive test today. They have it in the Washington Post. Sorry.
Okay, thank you for your talk. My question is, first of all, to Sevim, I believe you are a member of the Social Democratic Party? No. Which party?
It's called, it's a new party.
Oh.
But I can
we can tell you.
Oh, okay. So anyway,
Yeah.
what are the German people's attitude at this time about the U.S. troop presence in Germany? I mean, this is now 75 years since the U.S. troops, occupied Germany, and they're still there. And can you tell us
More and more.
how many U.S. troops are there at the present time, and why, German people are not demanding that they go home? Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take one more. I'm taking notes too as well, and then we'll come back as well. Thank you, sir. Please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Irving Lee. Thank you for the presentation. My question is dealing with the fact that there's a commonality, it appears, between what's going on in Europe, acceptance of war, and what's happening in the United States. And it's clear to me that what's happening in the United States is that we have a government that's being controlled internally by an unelected force that is basically determining our foreign policy and our economic policy. And I basically focus on the role of the neoconservatives that are very dominant, especially in the State Department. As long as they're in charge, they're going to influence policies, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans in power. And you talked about how in Europe, those forces that were maybe opposed to escalation, I think in Germany there was a person by the name of Alfred Hirhausen, and the name that rings a bell to you, that during the end of the Cold War, he wanted to basically stop NATO and have a separate foreign policy, but he was physically removed, forcibly removed. And so that's the type of thing that has happened not only just in Europe and the United States. You had, of course, John F. Kennedy, who was against the Cold War. He wanted nuclear disarmament, and of course he was removed as a consequence. So you have all these powerful forces internally that is driving these policies. And it seems to me that one of our focal points is to say, look, we got to bring back our government and not have a secret government driving these policies right now. And that's really what our focal point is. Otherwise, we can't accomplish anything. That's why whatever rational discussions or policies that you make is never going to happen, because we have irrational people running our government right now.
Well, thanks everyone for the questions. I think we all took some notes, however you want to take them, but I think some questions about, how we can move on from NATO, also the German people, U.S. troops, and some of the other pieces. So yes, however you want to take that.
Yes, maybe first, I was elected to the German Parliament 2005, and with the party, the Left Party, it's called Die Linke, the Left Party, and in 2023, last year, me and 9 other MPs, we left the Linke Party and built a new party. And this party is called Sahra Wagenknecht Alliance. It's called after Sahra Wagenknecht, the person. And for tactical reasons, we used her name at the moment for the elections. Sahra Wagenknecht for Reason and Justice. And we launched our party on 27th of January 2024, this year. So it's very fresh, very new. And but we already made very good success in the European parliamentary elections in June this year. First time in the history of Federal Republic of Germany, a party which is just 6 months old had a result more than 5% for a national elections. We got 6.2% at this national elections. We have 6 seats in the European Parliament now, and we are heading now to the state elections. We have the 16 states. We are a federal system, 16 states, and in 3 states of Germany and the east of Germany, we do have elections in September. And according to the polls, we are the 3rd strongest party in these 3 states. And the polls are showing us for the next federal general elections next year in autumn, in September 2025, at about 9 or 10%. And I think we can even get stronger than 9% or 10% next year when we have the very successful, hopefully successful elections in the east of Germany. And and this party has 4 programmatic pillars. The one is economic reason. The second is social justice. The third is a peaceful foreign policy, more sovereignty, and more diplomacy. And the fourth is freedom. That means against cancel culture and for the freedom of expression. That's because we are facing more and more shrinking spaces in terms of freedom of expression. So more and more people get cancelled because of their positions regarding Gaza, regarding COVID, regarding Ukraine. They are just defaming people. If you are not in favor of weapon deliveries, but in favor of diplomacy and negotiations, they defaming you as a pro-Putinist, Kreml asset. And if you are in favor of the position that even Palestinians are human beings, then they defame you as anti-Semites against Israel, anti-Israel, and the people who have been critical to the COVID measures and to all these shutting downs and the vaccine mandate, for example. They called right-wing, extreme right-wing. Actually, everyone is fascist. Everyone is extreme right-wing in the opinion of the elites if they are not on the mainstream track. And this is something which poisons the democracy in Germany, the society in Germany. We have to get rid of this poisoning of the democratic discourse. We need, again, more freedom, more freedom of expression, and have to respect the other one, even if we don't agree on his position, but we have to respect his position and opinion. This is our program, and I think many people are supporting this.
Could I just ask, because
Yes.
I don't think people here know, that there was a 5-page profile of Sevim in Der Spiegel, which is the equivalent of Time magazine. I'm just wondering how that came about, because that's unusual, because the media tends to demonize left parties or what you've been talking about.
Yeah, they try to demonize, but otherwise, on the other side, they are very interested in the new project as well, and want to show who are the actors of this new project. But that's true. It's very unusual to get a positive profile in the German mainstream in the Time magazine. The other thing is with the U.S. bases. Yeah, I mean, at latest, after the wall came down and we had the reunification in Germany, normally NATO had to dissolve themselves, and the American troops, the soldiers, they should have leave the country. I mean, the French soldiers left the country since a long time. The British left, the Soviet left, the Russians, and the only soldiers we have on German soil, foreign soldiers, are the US Americans. And a few years ago, we had about 40,000 US soldiers. Since the Ukraine war, I think we have about 79,000. And we have about, I think so, because they're getting more and more troops at the moment. And they say for the military training in the Baltics, in the Baltic states or in the Baltic Sea, blah, blah. But we have 30 bases for military from the US, for US Army. 30. It's the most. I mean, you have just, 7 or something in Italy. You have in France some. You have in Turkey some. You have in a lot of states on the European continent. But 30 on German soil. And we have also the nuclear bombs. Yeah. We have about 20 US nuclear bombs in Büchel. They stationed. And despite the fact that we have a resolution passed by the far majority of the German parliament in 2010 that the nuclear bombs should be pulled out by the US from German soil, they don't do it. They just don't do it. And we have sometimes a change, but we have almost a majority for the will that we have more than a majority for the will of the population to send them back the nuclear bombs. And sometimes it's changing regarding the US soldiers, Because of the propaganda, the propaganda is they are protecting us. The propaganda is the military bases giving jobs for the German laborers. But this is not true. This is just not true because when you see this military bases of the U.S., it's actually all isolated spaces where just Americans are working there normally. Yeah. They're shipping fruit. They do everything comes from U.S. It's like a sovereign territory of the United States on German soil. And I think, when we talk about sovereignty, I think it's a matter of sovereignty of the Germans to get the U.S. troops out of the country and their nuclear bombs. And the other thing about the question about the NATO. From inside or from outside, well, it depends. I think what is the most the biggest danger for the NATO, or let's say for the West, because it is the West, is the BRICS. The BRICS countries and the New Development Bank. What I visited last year, the New Development Bank in Shanghai, was it's also a symbol that I was the first European politician who visited last year the New Development Bank in Shanghai. And that shows the symbol of arrogance and ignorance by Europeans regarding the BRICS, the institution of the BRICS, and the bank. And they are really scared about the New Development Bank, that they're going to de-dollarize the international financial system. And they're moving forward for that, step by step, slowly, like a tank, but it is rolling, it is moving. And the other thing is, from inside, I believe that the social cuts as a reaction, as a forced reaction for the rearmament, the massive rearmament and the militarization in the NATO member state, that will explode one day, because people are getting upset. And as I said, with the elections of the European Parliamentary, and for example, in Germany, our success is one of the reasons for this policy, because we are criticizing this, and people are getting more and more aware that they do not want such a militarization on their costs, and it has to cost something, because, as I said, you cannot spend the dollar twice.
Yeah. Nord Stream, yeah.
Yeah, with Nord Stream 2, what can I say? Everybody could watch the press conference with the German Chancellor Scholz and the US President Biden in 2022, before the war started in Ukraine, where the US President is predicting that Nord Stream 2 will be destroyed if it comes to the war. And the German Chancellor just, standing there and saying nothing for that. And but the example of the communique of the Washington summit now, with sending Tomahawks missiles again on German soil now, that shows us again, like the example of the Nord Stream 2, how subservient these NATO member states are, and they have to be, because that was the deal. You giving up your sovereignty in getting the protection of the US. That's what they think. And but I do think that US is not interested in allies or something. They're just interested in slaves and vessels, and they want to, and they would even throw you under the bus if it's in their interest. And Nord Stream 2, we don't have any a parliamentary investigation on this because they're blocking it, the governmental parties, and we do have official investigation, but by the departments, but crime departments. But when I asked, I asked the German government how many people are working on the investigation. You know, it's the biggest terrorist attack on our infrastructure, on our sovereignty about energy. And I think you should have more investigators than on a normal robbery in a shop, you know. So, and the German government, they rejected to give a response. They said because of state interests. It's in the interest of the national security to don't say how many investigators are on this case.
That's another key on the
As far as I know, there are just 4 or 5 investigators on this. You know, and this is like robbing a bank or something, has a little bit more investigators than the Nord Stream 2 case, and that shows us who is the cook and who is the waiter.
One way that NATO may be undermined is the pivot to the east, because it's going to pivot as Russia and China come closer together, and you have the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, you have BRICS. So the clash in that part of the world could be extremely dangerous. The de-dollarization is something I don't fully understand, but is a real blow. I believe there are 800 bases around. I mean, that is a number that's thrown around. It's worth looking at very carefully. I mean, in the end, the NATO should have ended when the Warsaw Pact collapsed. Yeah. And I'm a little obsessed with this because Walter Mosley's an editorial board member of The Nation, and he told me he was going to Comic-Con. I said, Comic-Con? That's been abolished. He said, get a life. I'm going to the Comic-Con in San Diego. But more seriously, the bases, it's, you know, the view is it's jobs. But that's, again, that has to be taken down.
Well, Sevim, I want to give you the opportunity for a last word before we close, if there's anything you want to leave us with.
Maybe 2 things. It's very often said that the first casualty of a war is the truth. I think the truth is knocked unconscious long before a war starts. And it's our duty to help this truth on its feet again. That is very important, I think. The second thing is the case of Julian Assange. I was campaigning for him, for his release, for his freedom for 12 years. And you
were on the forefront.
Yeah, that shows, I mean, it was only possible with the international solidarity movement, the international support also from the People's Forum people, and the diplomacy of Australia, the negotiations we pushed especially in the last 2 years, and but it was possible. It was possible that someone who challenged the empire is free now, and he's undefeated. So that means if we stick together and if you fight, we can win. That's my last word.
That was beautiful. Transnational solidarity. I usually don't do this, but The Nation turns 160 next year, and I think its main through line in its history has been the belief that you don't have democracy at home if you wage endless war abroad. And from the beginning, that has been our mantra, our motto. And for a publication which has opposed NATO expansion, is for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and has opposed endless war, please check it out, thenation.com.
Absolutely. Yes. The book is NATO: A Reckoning with the Atlantic Alliance. The author is Sevim Dagdelen. The foreword is by Katrina vanden Heuvel. Excuse me. Please give a great round of applause for both of our panelists here this evening. You can get the book up front. I highly suggest you purchase it. Maybe get a couple copies I know Sevim is willing to sign some as well, so you're very lucky you. But thanks, everyone. Thanks to the People's Forum. Thanks to Left Word Books that helped translate this into English from German, excuse me. Thanks to everyone. Have a great evening, and hopefully come to future events at the People's Forum.